Gaming. We're going to start off with alternative platforms. This is virtual reality, of course. That's her phone she's got plugged into her virtual reality headset. I've never done that before. Anyway, while there is much debate about the first video game, mostly over what criteria to use to constitute a video game, the first endeavor that looked like a video game was called Tennis for Two by one of the scientists working on the Manhattan Project, Willie Higginbotham. And if you've seen the movie Oppenheimer, that was the Manhattan Project, of course. The game very much looked like the future Pong, but since it was never developed further or manufactured commercially, it is mostly known to technological historians and gaming geeks. Tennis for Two. The first video game to find a large audience and be available beyond a single exhibition was Space War. It was initially developed by three students at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Stephen R. Slug Russell, J. Martin Grates, and Wayne Wittinen. In 1962, Space War allowed two players to control dueling spaceships and attempt to shoot each other with torpedoes while orbiting a black hole. Space War, played using a cathode ray tube display and custom-built controllers on the Digital Equipment Corporation's PDP-1 computer, also featured a score display. Now you have to remember, in 1962, computers were the size of desks, not the size of television screens or laptops. They didn't look anything like that. They were massive, quite large, and they weighed a lot of weight. This and other competition-oriented features ensured that Space War was a hit. Within a year of its 1962 demonstration at Massachusetts Institute of Technology's annual Science Open House in May 1962, copies and variations of the Space War program began to emerge at research laboratories across the United States, and the game was being played not only on PDP-1 computers, but on other computers that used a cathode ray tube display as well. Now, you guys probably have never seen a cathode ray television because all of your televisions have been digitized. But in the old days, you had to have a cathode ray, which, that's what it looked like. This Space Wars thing, that's what it looked like. But a cathode ray was, how can I explain it? It was about the size of a watermelon, of a large watermelon, and it weighed about the same amount. And so all televisions had tubes instead of digital connections, and so they were really heavy. Televisions used to be extremely heavy, and that's what a cathode ray was. They were only this big. That's the screen. While the actual Space War game, as originally programmed, could not be commercialized because it was played on expensive research computers that were usually inaccessible to the public, the first coin-operated arcade games were both adaptations of Space War. Galaxy, a one-of-a-kind arcade unit that debuted on the Stanford University campus in Palo Alto, California in 1971, and was the first coin-operated video game, and Computer Space, a mass-produced coin-operated arcade game released later the same year throughout the United States. Okay, so video games weren't really played by the public. They were played in research laboratories, but they weren't played by the public until 1971. Now, 1971 is the year I graduated from college, and was also the year that I went into the Air Force. So there you go. That dates me for one thing, but it also tells you how long ago it was. I'm 75 now, so it just tells you how long ago all of this took place. Therefore, whatever early device is credited as the first video game, there's no debating that Space War accomplished two milestones important to the scalability of the video game as a mass medium. It was the first video game to be played on more than one machine and the first video game to be adapted for commercialization. And that's what it looked like. 1972 saw the release of the first commercial home video game console, the Magnavox Odyssey, which featured sport and shooting games among its game titles. The Odyssey console used light signals combined with overlays placed on the user's television screens to simulate graphics and featured predominantly sports and action games, though some games featured other simulations such as roulette. The popular Atari video computer system, the VCS, later renamed the Atari 2600 as later console versions were developed, was released with a game titled Combat that featured 27 combat games such as tank and biplane duels. Now, this is 1972. I didn't have any of this stuff. I had kids at the time. I had children who were kids at the time. My daughter was 3 in 1972, and my son was born in 1972. Through so much technological advancement over decades, though, the video game industry's most popular titles remain heavily fixed in the themes of simulating sport and combat that inspired the first video game prototypes. The top 10 best-selling video games in the United States in 2013 included 2 games from the perennially popular military-themed Call of Duty franchise, Call of Duty Ghosts, and Call of Duty Black Ops 2, as well as Battlefield 4, another entry from the popular military-themed series. 2 more video games, chart-topping Grand Theft Auto 5 and Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag, included combat simulation as a heavy component of their themes. Madden NFL 25 and NBA 2014 represented annual releases from the sporting franchises, the annual entry from the popular FIFA video game series, a notable omission from the U.S. list given its popularity in much of the rest of the world, with Just Dance 2014 arguably something of a sporting simulation as well. Of the top 10 sellers in the United States, then only the console edition of Minecraft and Disney Infinity were not primarily action simulations of war, combat, or sport. In 1978, 2 British computer science students at the University of Essex, named Roy Trubshaw and Richard Bartle, finished the first functioning version of a very different kind of game that they would continue to refine and develop through 2 more versions through 1980. While even the term video game indicates the importance of rich graphical representations to most examples of the medium, Trubshaw and Bartle's game had no graphics at all. Their game, Mud, a multi-user dungeon, instead relied on interactive text commands and automatically generated text feedback for all the players' interactions with the game program, as well as between players using the game at the same time. To play Mud, users connected to the game online by creating and logging into character accounts with names and statistics describing attributes such as stamina. Using these characters, which existed in the game solely as text descriptions like all of the game's other elements, players then navigated a vast game environment by typing commands to travel from location to location, interact with objects and features of the environment, talk to other players, and fight with both other players and computer-controlled characters. The game's program responded to the commands with text feedback, such as descriptions of places, characters, and objects, as well as feedback describing the results of attempts to carry out actions such as picking up an object or attacking a foe. Aside from indulging in these game dynamics, players could also have conversations with each other via text, either privately or in view of other players. An inspiration of Zork and Colossal Cave Adventure was the paper and pencil dice-based tabletop role-playing game Dungeons & Dragons in 1974. Created as a partial adaptation of existing strategy war games, but with players controlling individual characters instead of military units, Dungeons & Dragons was the first commercial role-playing game and has remained a dominant fixture in the genre since. The popularity of Dungeons & Dragons themes and mechanics in MUD games was perhaps predictable considering that Dungeons & Dragons players were using online networks as a rudimentary communication tool to facilitate playing their tabletop games across distance even before MUD was created. A key source of thematic inspiration for Dungeons & Dragons was the famed work of J.R.R. Tolkien, a British professor at Oxford University who produced influential scholarship on topics such as Old English epic poem Beowulf, and who achieved much popular fame by penning best-selling fantasy novels such as The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. Tolkien's work, a popular culture staple by the 1970s, had a heavy imprint on the themes of Dungeons and Dragons, as is best evidenced by the inclusion of several fantastic creature species, including Tolkien's iconic hobbits from Tolkien's stories in the original versions of the game. Habitat, released online in 1986, allowed players to interact with each other and the environment via text commands, and also represented characters, objects, and settings with simple graphics. Rather than a fantastic setting, the Habitat game environment included more mundane elements such as apartments and bank machines. The graphics of Habitat were mostly static, and the gameplay and interaction between users was mostly driven by text commands and text chat. In 1991, Neverwinter Nights brought more dynamic graphics that portrayed movement each time a player moved the character avatar with a keyboard arrow key. The game was successful with a peak subscriber total of more than 100,000 by 1997, and its graphical advancements have earned it retrospective recognition as the first graphical version of the massively multiplayer online role-playing game genre. Given the catch-all nature of the term video game, clear articulations of the medium's economic impact and audience are elusive, given that the diversity in the range of technologies, forms, and themes described as video games is mirrored by diversity in their range of business models and users. Some current estimates of the total revenue of worldwide video game market are in the neighborhood of $81.5 billion to $93 billion US dollars, with continued growth predicted in the coming years. The first video game subjected to moral panic was the 1976 driving simulator Death Race, an arcade machine in which players sitting at the controls of a physical steering wheel and gas pedal earn points for using their on-screen car as a weapon to run over gremlins. The game sparked controversy for essentially encouraging players to use their cars in an aggressive manner, awarding them points for committing vehicular homicide, reminiscent of the 1975 film Death Race 2000. Researchers proclaim that while television violence is passive in Death Race, a player takes the first step to creating violence. The player is no longer just a spectator, he's an actor in the process. Death Race, and that's what it looked like. The most prominent illustration of the limits of what a public would be willing to accept in a violent video game can be found in the 1992 release of the arcade fighter Mortal Kombat. Mortal Kombat broke an implicit taboo about what was okay to put in video games, such as the game's use of motion capture technology to display realistic human body movement, the intense focus on blood and gore during in-game fights, and the not-so-secret fatality special moves where players could brutally kill each other through a series of beatings, beheadings, and disembowelments based on the talents of the gamer as well as their in-game character. Although the game's reputation in arcades had drawn some criticism from activist groups, it was the game's home release on September 20th, 1993, or Mortal Monday, as labeled in a $10 million advertising campaign by producer Acclaim, at the time the largest advertising campaign ever for a video game that was most concerning for a critical public. Prior to release, Nintendo censored out the blood and violence and altered the fatality moves to make them less graphic in their Super Nintendo version of the game. While not editing the original game code except to make it compatible with other systems, Sega chose instead to label the game packaging with a MA13 as not appropriate for children under the age of 13. However, in the face of intensifying congressional scrutiny to answer questions about whether or not games were training killers and encouraging graphic violence, the two companies instead chose to debate each other's relative moral stance. Complicating these debates was a complete lack of any scientific data on the potential impact of video games on aggression, leaving all sides of the argument with little or more than empty rhetoric on which to base their claims. In the face of mounting public, governmental, and industry pressure to address the moral panic caused by Mortal Kombat, 1994 saw the creation of the entertainment software rating boards, an independent organization funded by the gaming industry and designed to empower consumers, especially parents, with guidance that allows them to make informed decisions about the age appropriateness and suitability of video games. Mortal Kombat was the first game ever assigned ESRB's M rating for mature audiences only. And there it is right there for 17 plus. An established rating system did little to quell moral panics related to video game violence, and a series of high-profile school shootings in the U.S. reignited concerns that video games served as an interactive murder simulations. Investigations into the causes of tragic incidences in Paducah, Kentucky, December 1st, 1997, and Columbine, Colorado, April 20th, 1999, by politicians implicated video games as a root cause. On the surface, linking violent video games to school shootings was a simple matter of observational deduction given the increased popularity of the first-person shooting game in the 1990s. Games such as Wolfenstein 3D in 1992 and Doom 1993 ushered in a genre of video games in which the player was effectively placed in the shoes of the main protagonist, a Nazi prisoner in the former and a space marine in the latter, armed with high-powered weapons and challenged with navigating a series of mazes and puzzles while being attacked on all sides by enemy soldiers and demons. As games gained in popularity, the content of games became increasingly scandalous, such as the most commercially and critically successful games in the medium's history with Grand Theft Auto. The 2001 release of Grand Theft Auto 3 popularized the sandbox genre of video games in which the player has the ability to navigate the environment as if it were real. In this game, players adopt the role of a criminal involved in any number of organized crime activities, from car theft to drug running, prostitution, and murder. The content is decidedly dark, from the theft of vehicles to get from one mission to the next to the murder of rival crime bosses, police officers, and innocent bystanders who might interfere with the player's objectives. There were widespread fears that gamers would be a generation of fatties who never left the house, stereotyping the social unattractiveness and awkwardness of gamers. A case in point, James Dallas Egbert III, a Michigan State University student, went missing in August of 1979. Early fears about Egbert's disappearance centered around his fascination with the role-playing game Dungeons and Dragons, also known as D&D. Many early media reports suggested that he had taken refuge in steam tunnels below the school to reenact scenarios from the game. It was later discovered that Egbert suffered from severe depression and had entered the steam tunnels in an attempt to commit suicide in seclusion. Following the Egbert story, scores of panics regarding D&D players as malcontents incapable of discerning fantasy and reality led to similar allegations in the United States and the UK. With the advance of newer interactive technologies, the popularity of video games, especially among children, has reignited debates as to the role that mediated fantasies of death and destruction play in the shaping of future generations. The current empirical record is by no means invalid, but rather in the need of further refinement, of research designed to better describe, explain, predict, and eventually control the results of the interaction between mediated content and human interactions with that content. Doing so requires us to better understand our research heritage, to seek areas of replication and extension. The legacy of fear of media effects is just that, a fear rooted not in science, but all too often in the moral panics of well-meaning researchers less committed to understanding a phenomenon and more committed to stopping it before it is fully understood. Children and teens seem to use video games to meet a wide range of emotional and developmental needs. For example, managing feelings. A survey of 1,254 middle schoolers in 2 states found that many children use video games for emotional regulation, as an antidote to boredom and loneliness, to relax, and to vent angry feelings. This response from focus groups with 13-year-old boys was typical. If I had a bad day at school, I'll play a violent video game, and it just relieves all my stress. Trying on new identities. Many video games, especially online multiplayer games, allow players to safely experiment with new roles and identities. It's perfectly acceptable to play as a character of another age, gender, body shape, or species. Players can test how it feels to not only look different, but to take on a different personality or a new role on a team and see how others react when they do. Leadership and teamwork. Researchers have surveyed tens of thousands of people who play MMOGs, massively multiplayer online games such as EverQuest and World of Warcraft, about their motivations for the experiences with gaming. Online play in mixed-age teams, where no one knows how old or young you are, offers unique opportunities for teens and young adults to observe, learn, and practice leading groups towards shared goals. Online leadership experience has been linked to managing others in offline settings, such as voluntary organizations. Several studies suggest that team video game play encourages real-life helpful behavior. A study of British undergraduate students found that frequent players of computer games were more likely to cooperate for a win-win outcome with other players in prisoner's dilemma experiments. Competition and initiative. In response to a series of questions about why they play video games, more than 4 in 5 middle school boys and almost 2/3 of girls agreed with the statement, "I like to compete with others and win." The challenge and excitement of testing strategies against opponents may promote initiative and healthy youth development. However, there is an ongoing vigorous debate about whether aggressive competition in games with violent content might undermine empathy or promote harmful behaviors. Curiosity, self-expression, and testing limits. Video games allow children to escape real-world limitations and let their creativity soar. Boys in focus groups noted that over-the-top gory games are fun because I just love the fact that I know it can't happen. In a real world, there's limitations to what they can do. Games that allow modding, from customizing characters to designing buildings, maps, and more, let players express themselves in ways that would be costly and difficult in real life, and sometimes to share those mods with others. Players can also test theories or approaches, fail and try again without real consequences. What does my grandson play? Fortnite. He keeps buying these different outfits and different dances, and that's what the modding is all about. And of course, this costs lots of money. So Fortnite's making big bucks by allowing people to mod. Practice setting goals and coping with frustration. In the 1970s, Walter Mischel began a series of experiments with preschoolers on delay of gratification. They were given the choice to eat a marshmallow now or wait, usually 15 minutes, until the experimenter came back from an errand and get 2 marshmallows. This turned out to be a wonderful way to measure frustration tolerance and the ability to wait for a payoff. In longitudinal studies, researchers found that those children who learned ways to distract themselves and earn the second marshmallow had a wide range of advantages over their marshmallow gobbling peers. They proved better at planning and thinking ahead. They were more verbally fluent, resourceful, and attentive. They less rattled under stress, and they were more socially outgoing. These gains persisted into adolescence. Seconds of marshmallow resistance time even statistically predicted higher SAT scores. This is really kind of curious because when I was young, there were 6 kids in the family, and my parents used to buy bags of caramels. Now at that time, these were Kraft caramels, and the caramels, or caramels as we said back in Indiana, there were chocolate ones in there, but there weren't as many chocolate as there were caramel ones. Okay, so we would divide them all out, and it turned out that there was an exact number of divisible by 6 of the caramels and the chocolate ones. I assume there was because I never got to divide them out, but I'm assuming I got the same amount as everybody else. It was really kind of interesting because I have 2 younger brothers and 2 older sisters and an older brother. And the younger we were, the faster we ate our caramels. And I was the median point, and my 3 older siblings would always save their caramels. So we're always looking around trying to find their caramels. But that's what my parents did. Now, the reason they would buy bags of caramels is because my dad had a sweet tooth. And whenever he bought himself something sweet, he would feel guilty, so he would buy a bag of caramels for his kids. As funny as that is. Anyway, children with attention deficit disorder, ADD, both with and without hyperactivity, often struggle to stay focused and pay attention and are easily distracted except when it comes to video games. Parents and teachers comment that children with attention problems seem to have no problem concentrating on a video game for long periods. Given the fast pace of many games, some have wondered if video games might aggravate attention problems. Some studies have linked greater time spent with video games as well as television to increased risk for attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD symptoms. There's also evidence that pathological gaming, defined as persistent trouble controlling gameplay habits, despite bad consequences, is more common among young people who show signs of ADHD. One study found that teens with attention problems were more likely to go on to develop unhealthy gaming habits. We may be training our children to have ADHD. I want to show you this picture. I want to show you this lady's foot. Look at this. Okay, she wears shoes that are too small for her. You can see this bunion on the side of her toe. But look at her second toe. It is above her third toe and her big toe. Why is that? Because she wears those pizza-toed shoes, as weird as that is. And I didn't even notice. This is just a picture off the internet, but this lady's got a really deformed foot from wearing shoes that are the wrong size, are too small for her. Here, I'll put this back. Look at that. There's the bunion on the side of her big toe and her elevated toe. Now, eventually, she's young, of course, but eventually when she gets older, in her 50s or 60s, what will have to happen is she'll have to have surgery to correct that. Anyway, let's put this down here. There we go. Okay, sorry. I just find that fascinating. Because I have to wear shoes that fit my feet. My mother wore nurse's Oxfords. She was a nurse. She wore nurse's Oxfords, and she had a foot that's shaped like mine, shaped like a duck's foot. So it's much wider at the toe box than it is at the heel. And when you try to jam a foot that looks like this into a shoe that is narrow at the toe, that's exactly what happens. Bunions and overlapping toes. Children with ADHD, I'll stop talking about feet now. Children with ADHD tend to have problems with executive functions such as working memory and response inhibition that allow children to focus on what the teacher is saying, wait for their turn to talk, and keep track of assignments. A study comparing children with and without ADHD found that the first group did worse on a standard computer-based test of attention and inhibition, involving clicking on a series of alphabet letters. However, both groups did equally well on PlayStation iToy games that tapped similar skills. This supports other research suggesting that children with ADHD do better with novel, stimulating tasks that offer immediate rewards, as many video games do. Researchers compared to standard computer-based working memory training programs for children with ADHD to a program that added game elements, including a story, animation, and rewards. Children who trained with the game version stuck with training longer, improved faster, and made fewer mistakes. Other studies, which assigned children and adults to play action video games, found that gameplay improved sustained attention and reduced impulsivity. Despite these promising findings, researchers caution that it's too soon to add video games to ADHD treatment plans. Results of studies on normal populations may not translate to people with attention problems whose brains work a bit differently. Compared to attention problems, there are fewer studies looking at whether video games might contribute to depression. In a large study of urban fifth graders, heavy play of violent video games, 2 hours plus per day, was associated with a higher number of depressive symptoms. In a study of Norwegian teens, scoring high on a measure of video game addiction was linked to depression, but time spent on games was not. Similarly, young teens who self-report symptoms of depression don't spend more time playing video games or violent games compared to their peers, but they are more likely to play to cope with feelings and forget problems. A recent study of nearly 5,000 young British teens found that those who kept video game play in balance with other activities, with less than 1/3 of daily free time devoted to gaming, scored higher on emotional and social well-being compared to non-gamers. However, children who spent more than half of their daily free time with video games had more emotional and behavioral problems, as well as lower life satisfaction. Recent evidence suggests that more than half of Americans play games and have at least one gaming console in their homes. Among children, the numbers are even higher, with almost all boys playing video games and a smaller majority of girls playing as well. Women are almost as likely to play video games as men, and adults are as likely to play as children and adolescents. A third of American parents play video games with their children at least once a week, and just over half believe that games are a positive part of their children's lives. Games and gamers are ubiquitous. People play alone and together, at home and on the move. All this time spent gaming has largely been at the expense of time previously spent consuming other kinds of media, in particular TV and movies. Nonetheless, people have often worried that gaming has caused serious problems for social interaction and physical activity and health. However, data from gamers themselves question whether such stereotypes apply to the majority of gamers. The socially isolated, physically inactive teenage gamer certainly exists, but she or he is an endangered species. There is a lot of evidence that the young of many species play with each other and spend a lot of time engaging in generally fairly rough and tumble activities which seem to serve no obvious purpose. No obvious purpose, perhaps, until we start asking questions about what is being learned during all this play. Barbara Fredrickson argues that when we play, we are actually experimenting with new ways of solving problems in a safe environment which permits creative experimentation and does not penalize failure. Experimenting with new ways of escaping from a real predator is not a sensible thing to do. In contrast, experimenting with different ways of running away, dodging and hiding with your brothers and sisters might broaden the range of options you have and build physical and psychological resources that could help you survive when the predator is a real one. Fredrickson's broaden and build theory suggests that play lies at the heart of learning, and those individuals who play stand at a greater chance of survival than those who don't, precisely because they have greater flexibility in the behavioral responses available to them. Now, this is really kind of interesting because when I was a kid, we used to play games at night. We used to play hide and seek, kick the can, pee-wee stick down, and one of my brothers always won. And the reason he always won was because he was so good at hiding. He's got tunnel vision, and he sees better at night than anybody else does. The reason is because his eyes are deeper into his head. So he sees better at night. He also has brown eyes, and that probably has something to do with it. But when he was in Vietnam, this saved his life on numerous occasions, was the fact that he could see things that other people couldn't. And the fact that he could see better in the dark. So when they were sent out to ambush the enemy, he was able to detect the enemy before anybody else could. And that probably saved his life on several occasions. He was also a tunnel rat. One of the individuals they would send into these spider holes that the Vietnamese created. Anyway, it probably saved his life, the fact that he was so good at hiding. Even seemingly pointless activities such as tickling may actually serve an important function. Donald Black observed that places where we are most ticklish, the neck, the sides of the body, the exposed soles of the feet, are also those which we might need to protect in an emergency. Tickling motivates us to escape while simultaneously making us laugh. It simulates any emergency situation in that we need to protect vital areas of our bodies from being attacked by an opponent who is not going to give up. Play and fun are inextricably tied up with survival. Like soldiers on the firing range, young organisms engage in safe but violent facsimiles of real-world fight or flight, life or death situations. So long as everyone knows it's a game, with punches stopping short and teeth nibbling rather than biting, everyone benefits from the activity. Games can also be understood as meeting basic psychological needs. Video games can help us to meet basic psychological needs that are not always met through real-life activities, particular uh, needs for socialization, competence, and autonomy. One can inhabit the fictional universe of a video game in which, along with friends, one can seem to have a real, meaningful impact on the game world through one's own actions. And this can be powerfully motivating. Konrad Lorenz reminds us that aggression is a drive, a naturally occurring behavior which helps organisms get what they need. While aggressive behavior may not be appropriate in many situations which face modern humans, and aggressive behavior certainly is an important issue facing society, we should not fall into the trap of believing aggressive responses are never appropriate. Aggression motivates us to acquire what we need, achieve our goals, and help defend what we have from others who aggress against us. An individual who lacked aggressive behaviors on which to draw in times of need would not pass its genes on to the next generation. There is a natural component to aggression, and aggressive behavior is not necessarily a negative thing, although it may be if overused or used maladaptively. What are the effects of repeated experiences of aggression or repeated exposure to the aggression of others? There are two main responses to this question. Theories which focus on desensitizing effects of violence and exposure to violence state that repeated exposure to violence reduces its emotional impact and makes violent acts normal. If we live in an environment where, rightly or wrongly, we perceive violence to be normal, then there is nothing wrong with behaving violently ourselves. In this account, exposure to violent video games desensitizes people to violence, making them more likely to be violent in the future. Theories which emphasize catharsis view aggression and violence in much the same way as Lorenz, as drives which need to be discharged. The principle of catharsis is seen as a form of purging or purifying innate emotions and tensions, leaving us in a state of balance. Under these ideas, violent video games represents a psychologically healthy activity, and indeed we might predict that it would lead to a reduction rather than an increase in real-life violence. Different researchers choose different measures of aggression, and these relate with differing degrees of effectiveness to the sort of real-life behavior we are interested in. Sometimes the measure of aggression is not chosen by the researcher at all, but is simply already available. If we believed there to be a link between violent video game playing and violence, we might conclude that as the availability of violent video games increases, the amount of violent crime also increases. Our hypothesis might lead us to predict a strong association between the two. As violent video games availability increases, so does violent crime. Patrick and Charlotte Markey in 2010 argued that no one personality dimension makes a person vulnerable, but that certain levels in three of the big five dimensions, open to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism, when present in the same individual, might be critical. Those are the big five. Open to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. Their conclusion is that people who score low on conscientiousness, low on agreeableness, and high on neuroticism may possess a pre-existing disposition to be negatively affected by violent video games. Such people tend to be fairly unconcerned about the feelings of others, are likely to break rules and not worry about convention, and experience strong emotional reactions to events. When exposed to violence or frustration, people who have this vulnerable personality may respond strongly and without concern for social rules or the feelings of others. And I would contend that this is probably true. Working in the emergency room, some doctors can handle it and some doctors can't. I would say that these big three, are also would dictate whether a doctor would be able to handle the stress of an emergency room. There is a gene that affects the levels of an enzyme, monoamine oxidase A, which is responsible for breaking down some of the chemicals affecting transmission of information in the brain. About a third of the population has a version of the MAOA gene, which means that they produce lower levels of the enzyme. Such people are indistinguishable from those who produce normal levels of the enzyme, except when certain environmental conditions hold. Research examined the effects of MAOA levels and childhood maltreatment on violent criminal behavior. Neither MAOA level nor a history of childhood maltreatment had an effect in isolation, but in combination, the two accounted for a significant proportion of violent crime. There is fairly clear and increasing evidence that violent video games do not cause aggression, but may interact with biological and psychological characteristics of individual people, making some more vulnerable to individuals more likely to respond aggressively than before. And that is the end. So I'll talk to you again next week. We're going to talk more about video games and video gaming, some of the negative things about it. So I'll talk to you again next week.